Dr. Papanicolaou has published more than 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. He is the chief editor of the Journal of Hydraulic Engineering. He's an associate editor for the Water Resources Research Journal and the International Journal of Sediment Research. He is a member of several professional societies and has received numerous awards, including being inducted into the Iowa Academy of Sciences. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Papanicolaou to talk about the role of runoff and erosion on soil carbon.
Well, thank you very much, and a great pleasure actually to join the webinar series. It sounds to be a very organized way of sharing the latest developments on this topic, but also a series of other topics. So I appreciate the great introduction, and I'm going to basically share some of the experiences that we have gathered over the years as part of the National Science Foundation Critical Zone Observatory, and also a NASA grant that I had in Iowa, and your laboratory with John Hempel and a couple of other people. At that time, Larry West, now Doug Wazeki, but we actually, with the center in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, we did some near-infrared measurements using the VNIR, and also some good work, I thought, with using the KSAT as one of the dynamic hydropedologic properties. So we do have some, partnership over the last 5 to 10 years, I will say, or so. So what you see at the front page here, at the slide 1, is actually a plan view of one of the observatories that are part of the network in the country. And this is Clear Creek. Clear Creek is a tributary of the Iowa River. It is at the southeastern side of the state of Iowa. And this is very active project as we speak. And it's a hilly environment, so you have those rolling hills, and people assume that Iowa will be flat, but that's probably an anomaly. That part along the Mississippi River Valley is pretty much a very different terrain than most people envision. So with that, one of the challenges that we got today is to come up with observations that are scalable. Before I get into it, I'm going to show to you two great studies, and there are many others out there. But two great studies, one of them is by Sparrow et al., and then another group west, that is a DOE study, here my neighbors at Oak Ridge National Lab. And you can see one common thing of those studies is obviously looking to develop ways of increasing the potential for carbon storage. But a key difference of the studies is the study by Sparrow focuses on closing the budget at the critical zone, that is at the earth surface, the topsoil, and the other study is a study that focuses on the net ecosystem exchange. And what you see there is essentially a map that shows any values as they have been obtained from those studies. One common need that derives or stems out from these studies is that we need to develop tools that can provide us um, unique ways of mapping carbon redistribution across the landscape. There is a clear message there that we are very much in need of developing landscape um, soil organic carbon models that get us away from the soil column approach that has been very valuable, but incorporating a series of other mechanisms that reflect very much the role of management practice. So that is the common message. Um, moving on to the next slide. Oops. Moving on to the next slide. This is um, a global carbon project figure that shows in petagrams of carbon a carbon balance. And one thing that was very striking to me is that we do have a very good idea of fluxes coming out from fossil fuels emissions. We do have a decent idea of how much carbon is stored in the ocean. But when it comes down to how much carbon is stored in the critical zone, in the land, then that is estimated as a residual, meaning you subtract those terms from the total flux and you presume that this is how much is stored during, for example, what you see in that figure from 2000 to 2009. So how much is your carbon storage potential in the critical zone remains a challenge, and that has to do really with the heterogeneity, but also the dynamicity that comes into picture due to extreme events, due to agricultural erosion, due to other processes, biogeochemical processes, that have been affected. Their time clock has been affected by human action. What you see also there is that the other terms may have some error. For example, the land use change, how much contribution we have there, we may have a significant error comparable of the same order of magnitude like the average value. Nonetheless, we don't know much about carbon storage, and that is something that has captivated my interest and many of yours, I presume. And this is from the Canadell et al. Study, where in some ways it summarizes what I just said, which is we do not have direct measures, especially in agricultural lands. And that was, I mentioned earlier that we did a study with NASA, and one of the things that I remember talking there with Raman Emani from NASA Ames was we do not have enough data, and Jim Colladge from NASA Goddard, that we don't have enough data to verify, for example, their large-scale continental models like CASA. So that led actually to the study that we have performed over the years, mostly in Clear Creek, but also other parts of the country. Okay, so one of the things before and I know this crowd may be very much familiar with that, but one of the things that when we are discussing total below carbon allocation and we're discussing about storage potential, one important thing is to understand the various hydro-biogeochemical mechanisms that are involved. And you see on that blue plot there, and this is by Six et al., a very neat conceptual study where you can see that erosion, but also mechanical processes such as aggregate formation, macro aggregate formation, how they affect carbon storage, increase in some ways storage potential. But also you see the biochemically protected carbon. And that has to do, in some ways, can be helped depending on if you have aggregates, but also can be dependent on the microclimate and the soil composition and the prevalent environmental conditions that you may have in that soil column. So people have looked over a season and have looked along a hill slope from the summit all the way to the top, to the floodplain. They have looked how that carbon and how the carbon pools are changing. And essentially they have used lignin as a proxy, but not only. We'll come back to this in a moment. But what you saw in the previous slide is the column approach. We've seen, and I'm afraid actually when I converted my PowerPoint into a PDF, I didn't look carefully here, and some of those maps that you see there, the saturated conductivity maps are not showing, actually. I apologize for that. But on slide 6, therefore, what you see in contrast to slide 5 is that now your agency has moved from the incubation studies that they have been taking place in the laboratory or in the field over a long period of time. Now, your agency has used soil properties and soil texture to make inferences about the soil organic carbon, how much soil organic carbon is there, and those studies have been implemented, as I mentioned, with the hydro-pedologic type of studies, and one of those is a study that we've done in 2000. We published actually some of those results in 2015, where in geoderma, where we actually try to capture variability in texture and how that affects infiltration, and then also develop maps for the soil organic carbon in correspondence to the hydropedologic properties in order to get a better sense about the role of special heterogeneity in carbon redistribution. Moving on to the next slide here, what you see is bulk density shown here. This is a study, a time series of a study that was performed again in the Midwest, and what you see there is 3 crop rotations. One crop rotation is corn, oats, alfalfa, and the other one is corn, bean, and the other one is spring-till corn, no-till bean. And you can see this is simulations performed with a coupled web century model and you can see the variability in bulk density, and you can see actually the pattern change in terms of wavelength and amplitude in the signal that we are getting in those time series predicted by the model. Now, in this Journal of Geophysical Research study, actually, what we have also looked is we try to address how management practice affects old organic carbon. And I know the paradigm, the hypothesis that lignin is an old, represents old carbon, doesn't hold like it used to. The syringyl and the cinnamyl and they normalize it to the vanillyl, and they're trying to get basically some source proxies from where and which management practices basically those that lignin that is present in that field is coming from, is originating. And you can see in that plot here, on the upper left corner, right corner, I'm sorry, you have corn, and as we go down, we're dealing mostly with grass prairie that we have, restored prairie that we have in Clear Creek. So people have come up with various ways of trying to address some of those mechanisms that you see in this schematic here. The issue is that a lot of those processes are occurring concurrently. They're occurring in parallel with each other. But each of those processes may have different time scales. So the challenge is how the fluxes, the signal of those processes changes with respect to time, but also how that signal gets modified at different spatial scales. And therefore, how we can make this work useful in order to be able to develop models that then with in situ data, when they're supported with in situ, then when they're informed with in situ data, can be used either on a daily time step or, depending on what is the question, or a monthly or whatever seasonal scale, to be able to provide large-scale predictions for soil organic matter redistribution. So moving on, let me say here, this is a very interesting, nice picture, because what you see is you see a couple of different mechanisms of runoff, of types of flows. You see lateral contributions, you see concentrated flow, you cannot see the rain splash, but definitely the effects are there. Then you can see oriented roughness, and then you can see, this is the top, you see the finer material, that's the organically rich material being deposited, and also if you pay more attention, you can see residue being transported to the top. So, so what is that characteristic scale? And I'm not claiming I have the answer, but I'm claiming that probably I do have a fairly good idea what is that characteristic scale beyond which the signal in terms of exported soil organic carbon flux probably is not significantly changing beyond that scale. And what is that scale here is you see here in this schematic, in this conceptual schematic, is that if we develop models that can capture what is going on in about a kilometer square, then at that resolution, then I think probably we are representing most of the processes that contribute to, we are capturing most of the processes that are contributing in terms of soil organic carbon. And what I'm talking there is all three pools of soil organic carbon as they are defined, for example, in the Century Model framework. And what is that scale is about the kilometer square, where, and that has been, documented with measurements, but also has been documented with some modeling exercises. All right. So since the characteristic scale unit is the unit where the computational party starts, that's the unit scale where we try to compare top-down and bottom-up models. And what you see here, this is Clear Creek. It's about, believe 260 kilometers square. And what you see here is a bottom-up approach that uses that characteristic scale instead of going down to 0.85 hectares, where at the 85 hectares, where we assemble our signal. And as you can see, we split it, that 260 kilometers square, into about 135 cells. And in this particular case, we're running Tangery, Web, and a couple of other models, but at that scale, at that characteristic scale unit. Now, at the bottom here, what you see is a different set of models. Those are the top-down that work at the 4 by 4 kilometer square. And yes, those models are easier to incorporate climatic data, NEXRA data that come usually at the 6 by 6 kilometer square. Now you can go down even to a smaller scale. But the disadvantage is obviously that you get cruder estimates, and we don't know really at that larger scale, the 4 by 4, if we are sort of mapping out, if we are covering, if we are eliminating certain signals that reflect management practice. So this is important from the conservation practice point of view and also from the policy point of view. Because if there are certain management practices, or for example application of pesticides and fertilizers occurs at a certain time period, then we would like to see the signature of those applications being captured from the model. And hopefully this point will become clearer later on. But to summarize what we discussed here so far, what we are suggesting is that we need actually, we're not saying the bottom-up approaches are better than the top-down, or the top-down are better than the bottom-up. Each of those approaches have their pluses and minuses. The bottom-up approach, a plus of the bottom-up approach is obviously that you can capture, if you have a process-oriented model, you can capture really the non-linear interactions and a series of processes, competing processes or complementary processes that you may have. With a top-down, but the problem is if you don't understand all of the physics, all of the biogeochemistry, then you may be in trouble. So a first-order model usually may work in this case. When we are dealing with the top-down models, those are emergent pattern type of models. And those are models that they can give you a clear idea where are the hotspot areas and potentially where are those hot moments. But they cannot tell you what was the cause of the change, what triggered that change. So we need both models type of models, in order to be able to address some of those challenging questions, and in order to help with mapping soil organic carbon, or to develop effective, ways of surveying soil organic carbon. Moving on, in one of the key things here to support any type of modeling work, bottom-up or top-down, is to have a remote sensing information and also to have enough in situ sensors on the ground. We are very fortunate through the critical zone observatories to be able, for example, to work with the various sites that are part of the CZO network. For example, Reynolds Creek in Idaho, Upper Sangamon and Clear Creek in the Midwest, and then the Calhoun watershed here, basically in South North Carolina. So CZOs offer those in situ type of measurements that otherwise they will be very expensive and very difficult to obtain. And those are the measurements, the bottom-up measurements. But at the same time, your NASA, the Geospatial Center, and others, they offer the top-down, they offer satellite information that can be used for emerging patterns in the top-down approach. So very quickly, the bottom-up approach is essentially, I think everybody has seen an eddy tower and everybody has seen a field. So it allows for detailed measurements, sampling measurements that you see here, where with an auger or with a scoop, you extract soil cores, soil samples from the active layer. That's the top 30 centimeters, top 10 to 30 centimeters. And based on those approaches, you can develop maps, aerial maps, and you proceed up all the way to the bottom of the hill. And those methods can be fairly effective. And what you see here is a reflection for the same field, a reflection of management practice from measurements that were obtained in 7 years apart. And you can see actually in some ways this was a field that the farmer has applied conservation, and we were very surprised to see that difference that you see. This is a very striking, actually, difference, a remarkable difference that we see. And I have some other examples that also provide that very interesting view. But at the same time, what we are doing, we complement those in situ measurements with dynamic testing measurements. And one, for those who are familiar with the Century model and other models, one of the things that reflects how much erosion, the enrichment ratio. And enrichment ratio is the ratio of concentration of organic carbon of the eroded material versus the concentration of organic carbon that was there residing at that location. So the enrichment ratio gives you a good idea really of how much change, enrichment or depletion of organic carbon has occurred at a location. And obviously many people are, because we don't have direct measurements, I've seen very few measurements coming out either from Belgium or Italy, and fewer here of the enrichment ratio. And the enrichment ratio usually is assumed equal to 1 or close to 1 because we don't have those direct measurements. So a contribution of our study as part of the critical zone observatory is to have mobile units of rainfall simulators, and those are ARS designed. Those are the Norton rainfall, VJET rainfall simulators that they are mobilized from one location to another, and we are getting representative enrichment ratio values or depletion values for different management practices and different soil types. And this exercise is can be repeated in various locations. So I'm going to skip this, and because I'm taking probably too much time here, we see clearly that enrichment ratio is very much affected from the flow paths. And what you see here is when you have contour versus, and obviously the management practice. When you apply rain in an oriented roughness that is in line with your rainfall simulators, obviously you get much higher concentrated flow and much more erosion versus in this case here where you have basically almost like step pool type of sequence. And therefore we saw significant changes in the soil organic carbon and the enrichment ratio values. And we see, therefore, a direct connection of practices to the organic carbon redistribution. And in this hill slope approach, this is not general, but what you see here is in that schematic is that with R is the redistribution of the organic carbon, and you can see here that the eroded zone contributes significantly to the depositional zone, and here you see variability not only in the lateral but also vertical, in the vertical column. Remember the build-up of the material. Also, what you see here is also the aggregate stability presumably is reduced. The different size implies a reduction. And then you see the enrichment ratio value here is higher due to the erosion and mobilization of the organic rich fine air fractions comparatively to the lower location. And moving on, we use that information to a couple weapon Century. Both are very good models. We have worked with WEP for a period of almost now 15 years, and we modify WEP actually. With Dennis Flanagan, we have modified WEP and his team we modified WEP to have some other micro features, and we've tested it. But at the same time, we couple WEP with Century. Century does a very good job in doing, you know, carbon storage within the column, but when it was coming into updating the material that was coming into the soil column, then there were some built-in assumptions there that we, with the coupling of WEP with Century, we were able to remove those assumptions. We developed an enrichment ratio module that allowed us to make those updates without having those type of assumptions where material is supplied from the parent layer to the active layer and that type of thing. So in some ways, the reason I call a landscape-oriented approach is because now in that soil column, which is one of my overflow elements in WEP, I can incorporate lateral inputs, but also I can incorporate upslope inputs into that soil column. And this way, I can get a better soil organic carbon redistribution, especially by representing better the erosion and depositional processes. And that means reduce really the error by nearly 20 to 30%. And remember that big figure, the introductory figure that I've shown to you, where the land storage potential is estimated as a residual. Imagine the error that we could have there. I'm going to skip this. What it shows is the enrichment ratio value for the various periods, management periods, starting from 1930 all the way to current times. And then I'm going to focus here. This is a summary of the paper that actually I heard here today that got accepted. What you see here is in that busy figure is the soil organic carbon in the upslope area, that's the green line, and then the downslope area. And you see here the 5-year rotation, 3-year rotation, and then the modern rotation. That's the conservation here where we got no till. And what you see is obviously we had to initialize the model 3,000 years before that using the Burke equation and so on. But what you see here is essentially there is a decay, a significant, a sharp decay. A lot of material is getting oxidized, mineralized, but also a lot of carbon, but also a lot of that has to do really with the erosion that occurs. We see that there is a plateau between 1970, late 1970s, and then when the conservation practices kicked in, then we see actually a regain in soil organic carbon after 1990. I mean, there are obviously some assumptions here, some simplifications, but this is a very striking picture that conveys, sends a very clear message that conservation practices are working. And some of the stuff that NRCS therefore has mandated, from a lack of a better word, so to speak, are paying dividends. Moving on very quickly now, if I go back, this is from a hill slope. This is basically that small, grid cell that you saw there in the bottom-up approach. That is in that 85 actually hectare grid cell. So how we go from the 85 now to the bigger scale? There are a lot of challenges, especially in environments where there is a significant human modification, e.g., for example, in the Midwest, where you got tiles and therefore soil moisture um, and the presence of tiles have implications actually to the soil organic carbon. There is a very interesting study by Lou in South Dakota with the USGS center there where I think he has shown actually a very similar trend to what I have shown um, where there is a regain. You see a change in the gradient in soil organic carbon once the conservation practices kicked in. But he has shown that that regain is not so sharp the way that I'm showing it because he incorporated there um, the tile network. So there are other types of complexities also. um, the dissolved organic carbon, which is another topic, different topic on its own. And then how do we go from one location to another? All right, so one of the things, therefore, that we are doing this type of exercises is because we would like to um, perform carbon budgets. And one of the things that you see here is the NEE term. Then what you see here is the total soil organic carbon, including the liter fall. And this is then the summation of those terms results to the net amount of carbon sequestered. Now, by doing that, we were able, for the Clear Creek site, to come up with a map that you see here. A map that incorporates respiration, incorporates the net primary production based on the crops that you have, and you can see a clear difference here because Kent Park is in that part of the watershed, so it's a grass prairie and a forested area since 1950. So you can see a clear difference captured along with changes in soil. But one other important thing is we were able with the enrichment ratio module to incorporate erosion and deposition that you see on that map here. This is an example from Clear Creek based on those 85 hectare per year estimates where we see that about that Clear Creek is a carbon storage, is a carbon sink, and you see the amount of carbon basically sequestered. This is for the corn soybean rotation. Now going to the top-down studies, one of the advantages that we have in the site where we're making the observations is we got a NOAA toll tower that along with the eddy towers that we have, we can get a footprint of CO2 basically over a 25 mile radius, and actually larger. So we can capture basically those changes, but at a very crude scale, big scale, but crude scale. So one of the things that we mentioned is essentially the use of satellites, and you can see here from MODIS getting the LAI, various reflectances for soil, vegetation, and water, and then how we can translate that information and relate that to respiration. And these are efforts that have been sort of taking place for the last 15 to 20 years with success. This is various groups have, contributed on that. So one beauty of those approaches is obviously to be able to come up with similar type of estimations of how much carbon has been eroded and be able to close the carbon budget coming from top to the smaller time scale. And what you see here is essentially how we're using basically the differences in the vegetation index to get what we call a baseline erosion rate that is for a hill slope that is having a gradient of 30 with a gradient of 30 degrees. So we can do this type of exercises and be able to really go from top down. Another thing that a colleague of mine, Charlie Steiner, has been working with is using an atmospheric model, that's the ChemWRF, that I believe comes out from Colorado, and the VPRM model. And the VPRM model is essentially a very neat, simple model, as most of the top-down models are, to be able to provide, actually to give us an idea of how much respiration is taking place for 9 different land uses. But it's very, very simplistic model that essentially gives you that respiration, for example, as function of temperature. And it is not taking into account, the management, the details that like the microclimate in the soil. It doesn't take into consideration the different pools that are there and so on. So very quickly, therefore, that's the reason VPRM in some ways it's called a diagnostic type of biosphere model. So very quickly, what that model does is gives you, as I said, the respiration with a very simple regression equation, gives you the gross ecosystem exchange, and using, the mostly remotely obtained values, and then gives you the net ecosystem exchange. And you remember I gave, I believe on slide 2 or 3, I've shown to you 2 maps. One was the Sparrow study, and then the other one was the Trees West study. And, well, the Trees West study in many ways is giving you the net ecosystem exchange, and it is based on those type of observations. So the challenge is how we can compare those 2 models, because one model is working at the 85 hectare scale, and the other model is working in a much more larger scale. That is, the 4 by 4 kilometer square. So this is where we are. We are bringing, by doing basically some simple approaches, scaling down approaches, and using also some more complex scaling down approaches, such as fractal theory, to be able to, and fractal theory looks landscape heterogeneity, patchiness variability, and so on, to develop ways and scalars, basically, to be able to compare those models. And what you see here is 3 models compared for the NE, net ecosystem exchange, predictions. The blue line is the CASA model, that's NASA model. The red line is the web they sent, and the green is the WARF VPRM. And you can see that CASA and web tend to agree. Well, that's not surprising because CASA is based on century. VPRM tends to overpredict, and that has to do basically with the fact that is only temperature-dependent type of model. So you see there, therefore, the type of error. Whatever you do, very much, whatever approach, I meant to say, you follow affects also the answer that you get. So where we are going with this? Where we're going with this is essentially we feel strongly that needless to say that I am much more biased. I'm a detailed type of person, so I am much more biased towards the bottom-up approaches. But over the years, I have realized also the fruits, the benefits, that the advantages, or the possibilities that the top-down approaches can give you. Especially those possibilities have become much more now from opportunities to, I guess, reality when the remote sensing approaches have been used to inform those models and make those models smarter. So therefore, closing the budget, like any other budget, you have to sort of surround the problem from different angles. You have to attack the problem from different angles, from different directions. And I think the message here is that with the critical zone observatories, with the neon observatories, with the advantages in that have been made in computational time. Many of those models were developed when the Pentium machines were considered top machines, or the mainframes, or so well, we are obviously we got a much more faster computational time, so bigger scale now approaches and models can be used in addressing bigger scale issues. So the other thing is now to vouch for the bottom-up approaches. One thought is that with the observatories, the CZO, the NEON, we got a lot of detailed data that can complement some of the surveys that your sender and your agency has performed, I guess, over a period of years, incrementally and discretely in time. And we can use in some ways some of your data information to be able to improve, verify, and validate the models, the available models. So there is a lot of food there, and there is a lot of excitement in this area. There are many good groups out there that are doing excellent work. And the last thought that I have is some of those groups are pushing really for the landscape-oriented approach. This is an approach that incorporates, the recognition, the contributions of erosion and deposition. And it was a study by Gregoritz, I believe, from Canada, and the Manis group, the Manis study, where really those aspects kind of were brought up to the attention of the community, the carbon community. So with that, I'll stop here, and I had some movies also, but I decided not to make it complex, more complex as it is, and hopefully get some feedback, comments, and input.
Well, thank you, Thanos. We do have a question online. What effect do drain tiles have on erosion and soil organic carbon?
We don't know, really. We know that definitely where you have those tiles and where you got those tile leaks, you have clearly oversaturation, and you may get a switch of oxic and anoxic conditions. Nobody has looked at that time switch, which is, very significant. Nobody has looked at to quantify. In terms of erosion, I think in my opinion, we have altered significantly the time scale of runoff, and we have altered significantly the path that material makes it into the channel. So we got more basically concentrated flow going through those tiles, and what we are doing is really we are bypassing at a much faster rate flow and particulates through those tiles into the channel. So we are really not allowing time for transformations to occur. Kind of, therefore, no transformations are occurring, and that can be of significance especially in soils that are very, acidic. Probably you have seen the recent, publication that came out that I believe it was farmers in Nebraska, where I believe where the soils were acidic, and they were using, actually they had to use lime to be able to control that, but that was increasing the cost of and reduce the revenue, the net revenue of farmers. So we don't have really, I mentioned the Lu study. That study actually is of a crude scale. So some interesting trends can be obtained, but we don't have a good idea. Let me say one more thing, that as of recently, there is a recognition that because those tiles really, they have changed significantly the time scales. People have used the alternative tile intakes, where essentially those tiles, they have like a head box, like a bioreactor, and basically, but there is a very limited number of those. They're also used to control, it's a mixture of mulch and gravel, and they're used to control really also fine sediment going through. And it has shown some promise, but I believe there are only 48 alternative tile intakes in the state, for example, of Iowa, and a few others in Minnesota. So more studies need to take place there in order to be, to say this is the implication, or this is, I can give you a number. Clearly, though, you are affecting some of the cycling that takes place. and you are affecting also the soil water patterns, and you are affecting soil moisture, and therefore you are affecting decomposition rates, and you are affecting also the type of bacteria that you have in the soil, and therefore you are affecting the soil quality and overall soil health. And that's the problem that I can give you an answer, but that answer will be only biased because I am incorporating only, for example, the role of runoff or the role of erosion. But there are other implications there. There is the bio component, and then there is the rate of mineralization and decomposition that have been affected.
Well, thank you, Thanos, for your time and effort to make this presentation today, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had more than 60 people join in today's webinar. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel within a couple of days, so feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. And this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.